Good evening, everybody, and I would like to thank you all for having me and the opportunity to be a part of this presentation. And also very much like to offer my gratitude to my co-panelists for sharing their deeply impactful personal stories and thoughts on this dangerous and discredited practice. At this point, my role on the panel is to speak a bit about the work of the Trevor Project in fighting against the practice of conversion therapy, and to provide something of a call to action for those of you who are listening, who are thinking about this practice is clearly harmful. What can I do to stop it? What is my role in this movement to protect LGBTQ people, particularly LGBTQ youth, from efforts to change them? So to start off, the Trevor Project, for anybody who may not know, is the world's largest provider of suicide prevention and crisis intervention services for LGBTQ youth. For more than 20 years, we have provided telephone lifeline, chat and text services 24/7 and free of charge to LGBTQ youth in crisis who reach out to us looking for a listening ear, somebody who can understand and will be welcoming and affirming with regard to their identity, whatever that may be, or wherever they may be in coming to understand it. And in the course of those 20 years of hearing from queer youth, we often heard about experiences related to conversion therapy. We would hear from youth who have been undergoing conversion therapy. It is not working, and their feelings of failure and isolation contribute to suicidal behavior. We hear from youth who are afraid to come out to their parents or family because they are concerned that their families would reject them or subject them to conversion therapy, giving them the choice of either you undergo this practice or you get out of my house. And we have heard from youth who have lost a friend who underwent conversion therapy because that friend died from suicide. So this is an issue that captured our hearts early, and also the simple research and data with a connection between conversion therapy and LGBTQ youth suicidality made this into an issue that we could not ignore. And so at the Trevor Project, we have a campaign that we call 50 Bills, 50 States, where we are committed to seeing the practice of conversion therapy by licensed professionals outlawed in every one of the 50 states of the United States, at least as practiced on minors. And the reason for that, in addition to the powerful stories that you've already heard, are the numbers and the data. Reverend Robertson mentioned, I think it was Reverend Robertson, who mentioned the UCLA Williams Institute study that found that in 2018, that there were nearly 700,000 survivors of conversion therapy in the United States. And that there were, at the time it was 20,000, now it is 16,000 because we've passed additional laws since 2018, but 16,000 LGBTQ youth who are at risk of experiencing conversion therapy from a licensed mental health professional before they turn 18. In the Trevor Project's research, we found that 5% of youth in a survey, national survey of more than 34,000 LGBTQ youth reported experiencing conversion therapy or reparative therapy. For context, we also asked, has anybody attempted to change your sexual orientation or gender identity? And the yeses to that were closer to 2 out of 3. So that 5% number in 2019 is something of a floor. I believe you'll actually see our 2020 data later, which we asked the question a little more precisely and got a different number. Next slide. So a little bit more about why the Trevor Project exists and the work we do every day. We know that suicide is the second leading cause of death among young people in this country. We know that 50% of all trans people have made a suicide attempt, many before the age of 25. LGBTQ youth are 4 times as likely to attempt suicide than their straight cisgender peers. But on the good side of things, we also know that one accepting adult can decrease the risk of LGBTQ youth attempting suicide by 40%. So making changes and being that accepting adult, that makes a real difference and can save lives. Next slide. My colleagues have already mentioned that the practice of conversion therapy has been debunked and rejected by nearly every major medical and mental health organization in this country. The slide in front of you shows just a sample of the list of major organizations that have condemned this practice. The American Psychological Association, American Psychiatric Association. I have a colleague who likes to say every APA but the American Poodle Association. And there's a good reason for that, because we know the practice is harmful and we know it's ineffective. So back a little bit to Trevor's data. This is from the 2020 survey, more than 40,000 youth this time, in which we were able to dig down a little bit deeper into the connection between conversion therapy and who's actually doing the practice. So in this case, we found that 10% of youth reported experiencing conversion therapy. 6% said that it came from a personal pastor or priest, something like Reverend Robertson's story. 5% said it came from another religious leader or a counselor. That could be a religious ministry or camp, something like Gerard Conley's story. And the number that isn't on here is 3% who reported experiencing it from a licensed medical or mental health professional. Now you're probably doing the math, 6 plus 5 plus 3, that's more than 10%. Something that we have found that is very common is that you actually will see people undergoing multiple kinds of conversion therapy. And often these entities will cross-refer. A religious ministry will have a relationship with a licensed professional, or a licensed professional will have a partnership with a religious ministry or pastor. So you wind up with youth being subjected to multiple kinds of conversion therapy. What is important to know is that in no case is it effective. In the same surveys, we found that 42% of LGBTQ youth who had experienced conversion therapy had a suicide attempt in the previous 12 months. That makes them more than twice as likely to attempt suicide than their LGBTQ peers who had not experienced conversion therapy. What's not on this slide is that that same population are more than 2.5 times as likely to have multiple suicide attempts in the last year compared to those who did not experience conversion therapy. So what do we do about it? Thankfully, we see here some photos on the screen of legislative bodies. In this case, it's an Oklahoma committee chamber, where a little over a year ago, an Oklahoma legislative committee voted to advance a law against practicing conversion therapy on minors by licensed professionals. That was the first pro-LGBTQ bill to ever move in the Oklahoma State House. And that is one important piece of progress and part of an ongoing movement. At this time, 20 states, including such states as Utah, have passed legislation protecting youth from experiencing licensed mental health providers attempting conversion therapy. There are also about 80 cities and counties that have passed legislation that would similarly protect youth, including places like, just this week, we had a successful hearing in Lexington, Kentucky. Last week, it was Omaha, Nebraska. So this is something that is being addressed and talked about nationwide. And we are seeing progress, even in challenging locations, even in places that are not well known for being accepting of LGBTQ people. I'm sorry, the slide is actually a little too small for me to read. Just one second there. So yes, how are we working together to do this? In one part, we do this through coalitions in your state LGBT groups, national groups like the Trevor Project, legal organizations like the National Center for Lesbian Rights, where you have lawyers who stand ready to help you if you want to bring a case against a conversion therapy practitioner. We are engaging in public education, storytelling, events like this, getting the word out through media like the film Boy Erased, and just having this conversation. All of this helps to build a climate where people know that conversion therapy is still happening and that we need to put an end to it. And here's a slide showing a little bit of what that looks like. On the one side of the screen, you see a friend of mine, Paulette Trimmer. She is the mother of a conversion therapy survivor who in Virginia bravely told her story about how she helped to send her child to conversion therapy and how she regrets it. She and her son testified side by side, and I watched as policymakers' minds and hearts changed. In the middle, of course, we see the cover to the film Boy Erased, which has been sent to lawmakers and screened in community centers across this country. And over on the side, you see myself, along with some of my colleagues from the Trevor Project, and friends from PFLAG, an organization formerly known as Parents and Friends of Lesbians and Gays, as we stood together to testify to the Pennsylvania Mental Health Caucus about the harms of conversion therapy and why this practice needs to come to an end. That said, and we know that the practice of conversion therapy on minors by licensed mental health professionals is a minority of the conversion therapy happening today. We know that much of this is happening in religious contexts and that we need to engage that conversation directly. The Trevor Project, in partnership with Q Christian Fellowship, came up with an answer that we call the Good Fruit Project. What this is a specifically Christian case against LGBTQ change efforts. Trevor brought our data and evidence and our experience serving LGBTQ youth mental health. Q Christian Fellowship brought an authentic voice that is able to speak Christian to Christian, so as to have a respectful dialogue and call out what conversion therapy practices look like in a faith community, how members of faith communities can challenge these practices and find out if they're happening in their own church, and making a scripturally based case for loving people as they are and abiding by the golden rule to treat others as you'd wish to be treated. And most of all, arguing that conversion therapy bears bad fruit in the form of increased mental health struggles and suicidality. Next slide, just for the sake of time. We also included a discussion guide and provided the opportunity for members of faith communities to sign a simple pledge that speaks to how Christians are called to love and care for neighbors, including those who are LGBTQ, and calling and committing to not engaging in any effort to change someone's sexual orientation or gender identity, and to actively encourage their faith community to commit to doing the same. This guide has been received very well by faith communities across the country. And as the COVID pandemic releases, we look forward to being able to get it out in physical form, talking about it at conferences and other opportunities, so that people can understand, people of faith particularly, that there are alternatives and there are other ways to think about this and to come hear from a faith-based Christian perspective why conversion therapy is so dangerous and in fact simply not Christian. Coming up on the end of time here, but for anybody who's interested in learning more about the Trevor Project's work to end conversion therapy and on other legislative priorities that are beneficial to LGBTQ youth mental health and ending LGBTQ youth suicide, I would encourage you to please text Trevor to 40649 to join our campaign. Next slide. I believe we're on to the Q&A, and I look forward to any questions you may have.
Thanks, Casey. I appreciate you taking time on behalf of the Trevor Project to walk us through some of that very important information. I do have a question here for you. Before I ask my question, just a gentle reminder to our attendees tonight. If you do have questions for our panelists, please make sure that you utilize the question and answer function here on Zoom, so that way we can get those questions answered for you. So Casey, a question that we have for you is, for states that continue to uphold conversion therapy, will there be financial or business implications of doing so, and what are they?
Certainly. Something that has been exciting, especially in the last decade of my work on behalf of LGBTQ people, is to see the increasing involvement of businesses in speaking out on behalf of inclusion. And they do so because having a safe, welcoming environment where people can bring all of themselves to work and feel good about the schools their children are going to, the communities their families are living in, that is just good for business. So we know that whether it be simply not wanting to do business in a state that continues to permit the practice of conversion therapy, or whether it is a state that is actively trying to legislate discrimination against trans youth on sports fields, that it is our business partners are increasingly speaking out about the need to treat LGBTQ people with respect and dignity. In addition to that, the costs of conversion therapy, most importantly, they are in terms of the dignity and life harm and just the suffering that people experience. But you can also put a dollar number on the financial costs, not just of funds wasted on these practices that are selling snake oil, but also the financial costs of just loss of quality of life, up to and including, tragically, loss of life to suicide. So there are financial costs, if that is what is most persuasive to policymakers. There are also ultimately human costs, and for purposes of this conversation, I would note spiritual costs as well.
Thank you for that, Casey. We do have some questions here from the audience. The first question is in terms of contacting the Trevor Project in terms of legal assistance. So if someone was seeking support in terms of legal assistance based on an institution where they might have attended conversion therapy, what are the steps for that?
I would be happy to receive an email at casey.pick@thetrevorproject.org. But also, if I got that email, I will directly pass it along to my colleagues at the National Center for Lesbian Rights, who their website has a help desk where you can ask them, tell them your story, and see if you can bring a case. If you are in one of those 20 states that has passed legislation prohibiting licensed professionals from engaging in conversion therapy, you also are strongly encouraged to file a complaint with the state licensing board. So if the person who engaged in conversion therapy with you was a licensed psychologist, that would be the State Board of Psychology. And so I would encourage you to seek out their website. NCLR would also be helpful in helping to frame that or to see who to reach out to. But you can reach out to me and I can help you connect to our partners.
Thanks for that, Casey. We have another question here that says, for states that have banned conversion therapy, what other measures do you think they should take, or rather what's next for those states?
One of the first things I would say is to contact those licensing boards and ensure that they are putting out materials and informing all of the people who they license that conversion therapy is inappropriate and can subject them to discipline. So trying to encourage enforcement of these statutes. There is also federal legislation that would be something that you could support, contacting your members of Congress and senators, specifically the Therapeutic Fraud Prevention Act and the Prohibition of Medicaid Funding for Conversion Therapy Act. The second one is fairly self-explanatory. It simply means that no federal Medicaid funds can be used to pay for conversion therapy, and that a practitioner attempting to get paid under Medicaid would be engaging in Medicaid fraud. The Therapeutic Fraud Prevention Act is something that would have the Federal Trade Commission treat any practice of conversion therapy, regardless of age, so long as it is done for money, as the fraudulent practice it is. They are attempting to sell something that they have no reason to believe would be successful or appropriate. And so the Therapeutic Fraud Prevention Act is a piece of federal legislation that you can encourage your lawmakers to support.
Thank you for that, Casey. We have another question for you. So this one, what would you say to mental health practitioners who take a passive stance in protecting clients from the harm caused by conversion therapy by following the ethics code in the field and not intervening clients' intention to join conversion therapy?
I think that the role of a counselor in that case is always simply to be honest. So if a client asks you, do you think this is a good idea? You do not need to say, yes, it's a good idea. No, it's a bad idea. You can say that I am, under my ethics, not permitted to engage in this practice. We are not permitted to engage in conversion therapy because there's no reason to believe that it would be successful, and because it is correlated to serious mental health harm. So I think in that case, so long as we're talking about adults. So if we were talking about an adult client who's expressing their desire to seek out conversion therapy through an unlicensed means, I think you're in that space of saying, you can make your own choices. Here is the information that I can provide to you honestly. On the other hand, if we were talking about a minor, you may be in a situation where that would be something to call out and say, this may not be legal. This may not be legally permissible. So whether it depends on the age of your client. If your adult client is asking you to engage in change efforts, you are obligated to say that, I can help you to cope with your identity, but the science suggests that you're asking me to do something that is not possible. So I can help you to cope with your experience, but I can't try to change you.
Thank you for that. I think we have time for this final question that was submitted for you. And this question is talking a little bit about wanting to be an advocate, being that average person who seeks to be an advocate for legislation against conversion therapy, but while also addressing the challenges that might exist within the cultural context or religious freedom aspect.
So what I'm going to tell you is perhaps strange coming from a professional advocate, but I honestly think that the everyday amateur advocate is the most effective, because you have the ability to speak to your own personal stories, and those stories have power. So if it's about conversion therapy and you're talking to your lawmaker, you have that advantage if they represent you. I all too often am coming from out of state, or I am one of those Washington, D.C. People. But you as a local everyday person can say, hey, this is an issue that matters to me. When I was coming out, this was my story. I was afraid of conversion therapy, or I tried to change myself, or somebody tried to change me. It didn't work and it caused pain, and I wish somebody had stood up for me. It really doesn't have to be much more complicated than that. Speaking to the faith and religious freedom issue, for people who are people of faith, that is worth bringing up in the story. Whether you are perhaps a minister and you can say, I understand what religious freedom means and how important that is. That's the bread and butter of my job. But these legal prohibitions, they don't affect me. So anybody who says that the legal bans on conversion therapy governing licensed professionals are intruding on religious liberty, that's just not true. And that can be particularly powerful coming from somebody who identifies as a person of faith. So as to just combat some of the misinformation that we've seen. So everybody has a story to tell, whether it's your own as an LGBT person, whether you're a parent, a friend, a mental health professional, or a person of faith. you can find there's something that made you sit through this panel for 2 hours. Whatever that is, that's a story worth hearing.
Thank you so much, Casey, for taking time to answer the questions in the chat box. And also thank you to the attendees for submitting those questions from an educational perspective, because we are all learning and being educated through this experience. So thank you, Casey, for taking some time to go through those. I'll now transition over to Drew